Okay, Jan, you may start right now.
Thank you, Ursula. Yes, hello and good afternoon from Germany to everyone, and welcome to this online event with participants from the United States, Germany, and of course, Israel. Subject matter of our panel discussion is the US-Israel relationship under President Biden, with an added focus on the relations with Europe, notably Germany. This is a panel discussion, and you, the viewers, can also ask questions using the comment section on YouTube, and we will forward them to our panelists toward the later stages of the discussion. My name is Jan. I'm the chairman of the Bonn chapter of the German-Israeli Association, and we are co-hosting this event together with the American Academy Berlin. I now give the floor to my colleague Anna, who will introduce the panelists to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. I'm happy to present our panel to the audience according to the sequence of the different statements. So I start with Ambassador Daniel Benjamin from Berlin. He's the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And prior to his appointment, Benjamin was the Norman McCulloch Junior Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. Before 2013, he served as Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the US Department of State from 2009 to 12. Then we have from the States, Ambassador Jake Walls, who is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment Center for International Peace, where he focuses on Israeli-Palestinian issues, Tunisia, and counterterrorism. He was a foreign service officer with the US Department of State for more than 35 years, and among other stations, as a consul general in Jerusalem. And now, live from Israel, I present Dr. Shira Efron. She's a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation, and an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute. Shira focuses in research is US policy toward the Middle East and the Israeli-Arab conflict. And now from Bonn, we have Professor Ulrich Lee, who holds the Henry Kissinger Professorship for Security and Strategic Studies. Prior to his position, he joined the Foreign Service and the Federal Ministry of Defense. He's an expert for international relations and security. And last but not least, I'm glad to present Professor Andreas Kulick, who will moderate this panel. Andreas is an expert for international public law and human rights, and currently a visiting professor at University of Heidelberg. So now it's time to pass the word to you, Andreas. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Jan, for this very kind invitation to chair this illustrious panel. Very welcome to everybody for this, what I think will be a very interesting, very fascinating panel discussion on the Biden administration and Israel. Our panel discussion couldn't be more timely. It's not only that it's only 2 months since the inauguration of President Biden on January 20th, but also that just yesterday there was an election in Israel, and we will talk about the implications of that, I think, in due time. Still, the results are not completely, we don't know what the final results are. At the moment, it looks out in the prior Internet now. Included which
I think, Andreas, there must be an issue with your bandwidth. Maybe we will just proceed with hearing the panelists while this is sorted out. These things just tend to happen. Now, sorry to take it on like this, but maybe I believe the first in order is Daniel. I don't know if you would be prepared to give your statement right now, Daniel. Can we just pass the word to you? You are muted, by the way. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe in the 10th year of the pandemic, I'll remember to unmute. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Deutsche-Israelische Gesellschaft for putting this together. It's a very distinguished panel. I'm glad to be especially reunited with my former colleague, Ambassador Jake Wallace. And let me just say on behalf of the American Academy in Berlin, we're really pleased to be able to co-sponsor this event on this very interesting subject. So I will start by making a few observations on what I believe the US-Israel relationship will look like during the administration of President Joseph Biden. Joe Biden comes into office, as I think everyone knows, as a longtime and very strong friend of the Jewish state with a track record of support for Israel that goes back nearly half a century. His Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, with whom I have worked very closely in the Clinton and Obama administrations, comes from a very distinguished Jewish family and is a very, very good friend of Israel. Indeed, I would say in the upper echelon of the Biden administration, you have a more pro-Israel assemblage of Democrats than I think would otherwise be imaginable in 2021. And I say that because, quite frankly, the Democratic Party is more divided over issues having to do with Israel than it has been in a long time. It still is, overall strongly supportive, but there is a constituency within the party that is more critical of Israeli behavior than we have seen in past years. So having said that, let me just give what we call in the military the bottom line up front. This administration comes into office with a view that the affairs of Israel and its neighborhood are a considerably lower priority for action than perhaps for any administration in decades. That doesn't mean that there isn't strong support for Israel. On the contrary, most of the familiar pillars of the relationship will remain: unwavering support for Israel's existence and its defense, including the preservation of Israel's qualitative military edge. We will continue to have a very close intelligence and military relationship. I think that for now, the broad inclination is to continue to play America's historic role of protector of Israel at the UN and in other international fora where Israel is often criticized, frequently unfairly. There will also continue to be strong support, as there has been in every administration except Donald Trump's, for a two-state solution. I know that it's a matter of great concern, so it's worth noting that it's quite clear that the new administration is not going to move the embassy from Jerusalem. That deed has been done and it won't be undone. But at the same time, most of the problems of the Middle East are not high on the agenda. If anything, there's a great deal of Middle East weariness in Washington with the policy class, and particularly with Democrats after the experience of the Obama years. I think the view in Washington is that the top concerns are going to have to do with China, above all with Russia, with reviving America's alliances after the battering they took under Trump, with climate, and with high tech and a range of other issues. The administration has already moved moving back to the Middle East, the administration has already moved to restore its ties with and funding for the Palestinians after 4 years in which the US pretty much put all possible pressure on the Palestinian Authority to give up its aspirations for statehood. So in that regard, it's really a reversion to where we were in 2016. But I don't think anyone should expect any major effort to restart a peace process. I think the view in Washington is that the parties remain unready, that new leadership is required on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side, leadership that is committed to a peace process. There is a feeling that the Obama administration spent an enormous amount of time and energy and political capital on a process that was fruitless then and that would be fruitless under current circumstances. And I should add that although Israel's election results are not complete, and I look forward to what Shira Efron will tell us about the election, the campaign suggests that there is no near-term outcome in the election that is likely to change the situation. The campaign was fought over the future of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, not over peace with the Palestinians. So although the outcome right now in terms of coalition formation looks like a Rubik's Cube with no solution, because neither side is now in a position to form a government, Israel as a whole continues to move politically to the right, and that makes all prospects for a peace deal remote at best. So I think it's also fair to say there will be no tears shed in Washington if this is the end of the Netanyahu era, although the White House will say otherwise. The nearly month-long interval between Biden's inauguration and his first phone call with Prime Minister Netanyahu was not an accident. Even as staunch a friend of Israel as President Biden will not forget Netanyahu's appearance before the American Congress to denounce President Obama's foreign policy, or for that matter, the obvious tilt towards Trump and the Republicans that the Likud leader demonstrated over the last 4 years. There are a number of things that could prove to be moderate irritants in the relationship. One of them is the presence of an avowedly racist party, the Religious Zionist Party, in a coalition. And continued settlement growth will, as always, be a big problem for Washington. And I would not expect Washington to be quiet if either of those things happens. But the biggest flashpoint in the relationship, and it could be a very big one, relates to US engagement with Iran and the plan to re-enter the nuclear deal. As Shira Efron has written, the US and Israel are in very different places on the issue of Iran. Many Israelis have viewed a military conflict with Iran, I should say, as something approaching inevitable. And although there have been dissenters in the military and intelligence communities, the dominant view in Israel has been that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, is bad and that there should be no returning to it. And Netanyahu voiced this sentiment, I believe, on the day after the election, and the Israeli chief of the military staff, Aviv Kochavi, has said similar things, somewhat surprisingly, in fact. The backdrop for this debate has been that, although few in the West have paid much attention to this, Israel's military is essentially engaged in a long-term campaign to keep Iran out of Syria and to prevent the creation of a so-called land bridge to Lebanon, the home of Iran's Hezbollah allies. So why do I think this is a big flashpoint? Well, during the Obama administration, we had not only the political intervention of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington, but there was also great concern that Israel was going to strike militarily against Iranian nuclear targets, and that this would inevitably draw in the United States. There's I think, an accepted view in the military community that Israel could not do the job sufficiently with the resources it has at hand, and that the United States would likely be pulled into the conflict to ensure that there were no damaging retaliations and that the nuclear establishment was fully destroyed. This was something that really did agitate the officials of the Obama administration. So it's very early to guess, but if the election means that it's the end of Netanyahu's rule, I would imagine that few Israeli leaders would be so bold as to want to damage Israel's most important international relationship by taking a step like that to torpedo the Iranian nuclear deal. But again, who knows? I do believe that the Biden administration is committed to consulting with Israel and with the Gulf Arabs on its negotiations with Iran, and that it will try to answer concerns that these countries may have about the sunset clauses, duration of the argument, that sort of thing. But I think it's important to underscore one thing. Returning to the JCPOA is a core administration goal, and that is not going to go away unless the Iranians themselves show that they are not interested. So why don't I stop there? And I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Dan, thank you very much. Sorry for this quick disruption. Apparently now it seems to work a little bit better. My apologies for that. As you see, sometimes we make these experiences with online discussions. I'm teaching online courses all the time, so that seems to be happening sometimes. Again, my apologies. I will not repeat my little speech, introductory speech that I have prepared. As the next our next panelist that we will hear, we start with Daniel Benjamin. Now we will hear from Shira Efron on her view on the important topics from an Israeli perspective. Please, Shira, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. It's really terrific being with you all here, and it's an honor being with really esteemed panelists. And I hope it doesn't get very boring, because I think Daniel, Benjamin, and I are going to say pretty similar things, but I'll try to add some nuance from here. The biggest news in Israel, which kind of gets boring if you vote in, I vote both in the US and in Israel, and you vote in the US, it's once in 4 years. You can anticipate a change. There's a feeling in Israel voting for the 4th time in 2 years. And for now, it doesn't look like we're going to have a change. It gets a little bit, it's less, it doesn't matter where you stand on the political map. It just is not as exciting, let's say. For those of you who follow this, I'll just give this very brief. About 90% of the votes have been counted. What we have in Israel is not the absentee ballots like in the US. You cannot vote when you're not present in Israel, even if you're an Israeli citizen, unless you're a diplomat posted abroad, or if you're voting in military bases. So these are the 10% that they're counting now. We'll probably have final results on Friday. For now, the way it looks is that the Likud, Prime Minister Benjamin party, is the biggest party. It's 30 seats, what they call mandates here, out of 120. So that's also interesting, right? We say Netanyahu wins, it's still, we're talking about 25% of the vote. Because it's all very fractured. Yesh Atid is the second one. This is sort of the center left. This was 17. And then you have the different other parties coming in, and we could talk about it. We don't know. I'm just going to put all the usual caveats, because the 10% that are not counted can change the political maps in a very meaningful way. One seat here, one seat there would determine the ease with which someone can put together a coalition. And also, really, the ironies that are happening here, and I'll give an example in a moment, mean that maybe a day before there's a coalition, we are not going to know how it's going to look like, because there are different alliances and partnerships that were unimaginable previously, and I'll give an example. But if you would need to rank the likelihoods of events happening, there's a high likelihood of a 5th elections, probably as the most likely now. The second likely would be that Netanyahu, the current prime minister, has been a prime minister for 15 years now. not straight, 3 and then 12, is able to have a government with Naftali Bennett. It's a right-wing government and he's finding some defectors from other parties who said that they would not sit with Netanyahu. There could be an interesting situation where Ra'am, it's an Arab Islamist religious party affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, could support those opposing Netanyahu. But there could be the other situation with Ra'am enabling Netanyahu form a coalition government that is a minority government and supporting from the outside. And those are, I would say, as likely. Those are probably the four scenarios that we have. I think you know, Professor Benjamin mentioned it. Those elections were not on substance or issues. They were on what we call here to Bibi or not to Bibi. Bibi is the nickname of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a lot of identity politics involved in this. It's not just the persona that he is, but what he symbolizes in terms of the elites and different tribes in Israeli society. It's not a monolith. And that's how you divide these blocks. So you have very unnatural partnerships, like the one we just said, that you have Ra'am, this Islamist party, that could enable the formation. And I'm notoriously nonpartisan, so I don't want to. It's a factual statement of the most hawkish, right-wing, and racist party that Israel has ever had, with the affiliates of the Kahana party. Which was outlawed in Israel and is considered a terrorist organization in the US. And this could be getting the kosher stamp from a Muslim Islamic party. We will have to see. It's also really interesting if you think of the region, and we can talk about the Abraham Accords in a moment, where the rest of the region is trying to limit the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the UAE, Israel's new friend, in Jordan, in Egypt. This is one of the discussions about the elections, the Palestinian elections that are coming. Also, it would be interesting if Israel has brought the Muslim Brotherhood to the mainstream. I don't want to be all negative, because I do think that and I think the listeners probably know this, Israel's population is mostly Jewish, but 21% of the population are Arabs, what you call Arabs, but they're of Palestinian descent. The vast majority are Muslims. And I think that more participation in the central government is a positive trend. So if, you know, it doesn't come through the main door, it gets through the window in the long term, I think it's okay. And it's a failure on the part of the more political progressive Israelis that were so afraid that they would be criticized by the right for forming a coalition with the government that it ends up happening through the right. But I don't think it's necessarily negative. It's just ironic. So this is where we are, and it will affect the type of coalition that you will have in Israel. I think will affect mostly domestic issues, which brings us to the point of how this relates to Israeli-US ties. I couldn't agree more with, you know, Daniel Benjamin is right. Biden himself, he said he's been a friend of Israel all his career, Vice President Harris as well. The people that are staffing his administration, the higher positions, are big supporters of Israel's security. Biden himself, even with Netanyahu, he's had disagreements, and you mentioned the phone call, which was really quite that he has been friends with Bibi for 40 years, that he disagrees with him on a lot of things, but he still loves the guy. So there is really an amicable relationship. I think that if there's a government with a representative of Kahana, if Itamar Ben-Gvir is in the government, and if you hear statements about LGBTQ and about Arabs in general, I don't think the United States is going to be happy about it. I think Jewish groups in the United States, most of them tend to be more progressives, will cringe. We might have some parts condemning it, but I think no one, Netanyahu would never put someone like this at the position that they need to interface with the US. I don't think that Itamar Ben-Gvir himself, the person that we're talking about, would want this position. He said that he wants a portfolio involving the responsibility for the Galilee and the Negev, which for our listeners is where you have large Arab populations. So he wants to control them. So he will never interfere with the US. And this is one way to make sure that these issues don't come in the way of US-Israeli relations. If there'll be a sense in the US that because of different things, if this coalition evolves into something that really the prime minister dismisses the attorney general, right, and appoints a different one, and judges are played with, and Israel is deemed less democratic. And you hear these voices in the US, right? Israel is becoming, you have some like Erdoganism to it, this could, it's a long-term process that could happen, but I really think the ties are extremely important. For the foreign policy issues themselves, and Daniel Benjamin spoke about it, the Middle East is not a top priority at all, right? There's China and Russia and restoring alliances and climate change. If you need to talk about foreign policy issues from the US side, Iran could be an area of contention between Israel and the US, because for Netanyahu, someone told me from the IDF, someone very senior at the IDF said for Netanyahu, it's a religion, Other people think it's just a very strategic threat, but for Netanyahu, he really thinks it's an existential threat. I don't think anyone is making this up. And I don't think the Biden administration has any illusions about Iran, but they have a different interpretation of what it takes to make sure Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons than what it takes in Israel. That's very different from the previous administration. As you probably know, also in Germany, Israel pushed for the withdrawal of, Israel very much encouraged, let's say, the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal, and supported the maximum pressure strategy. Although, people will tell you here that they understand the maximum pressure strategy has not helped push Iran farther away from the nuclear weapon. But when you ask them, what do you want to do instead? So no agreement. What do you want to do instead? They say, well, let's continue more of the same. At one point it will happen. But it's really scary, right? Because you're in this crisis mode and what's going to happen. I will tell you that I was one of the people that, and I wasn't the only one, that I anticipated an earlier sort of friction between Israel and the US on this. I thought that the Biden administration would rush toward a return to the agreement because we have elections in Iran coming up. And you don't know if the people you'd have to engage with are going to be harder, right? At least now you know who you're dealing with. The administration and maybe others have speculations as to why they haven't done this so far, but they haven't. And Israel, I must say, has been acting very responsibly. There's no reason for them to object. There's no reason to go to Congress. There's no reason to involve different groups, because for now there haven't been any signs of an agreement approaching. I think this moment will happen. I know this is what they want to do, but you're seeing, right, there are confirmations now of Colin Kahl, and Rob Malley just came in a little bit later. There's some thoughts of how to do it and what's the best way of doing it. It's going to continue to be an issue. One thing that's going to be very different, I think, than what the speech to Congress that before is that now, there's a new Speaker of the House. Her name is Nancy Pelosi, and she's not going to invite Netanyahu to give a speech. So it's going to be different. But I also think that Israel learned the lesson, right? It's not, everyone understands Israel has to be more involved in the process. Derailing it is not going to work if this is a main US objective. So how do you influence it better? On the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is not a defining issue in Israeli politics. It's also not a defining issue in the Biden administration. A lot of these, no one wants to fight with Israel over settlements again. They've been there, right? The people, a lot of the staff has been there. They didn't enjoy the first time, and I don't think they anticipate it will bring a difference. Also, as long as the leaderships on both sides have not changed, there's no point pushing for a peace process. It doesn't mean that's not going to be an issue. It is going to be an issue, but not a priority issue. I think that this area, if you continue the way that things have been so far, what you would call, there are a lot of things that can happen, changing judges in different courts, that you've seen this in this coalition, paving roads in the West Bank, but those are not things that so much are on the radar, and they don't make headlines. They're not like an annexation threat. When it's going to come to a really flashpoint, like building in an area that is considered, a red flag from the US, we're going to hear something, I think. But unless this happens, I don't anticipate it to be a major point of contention, and that's a good reason. But it depends. Netanyahu could be forced. He's been very careful, but depends on the makeup of his coalition. He could be challenged to give the settler group more in return for what they're going to give him, which would be immunity from trial, from prison, from wherever we need to remind everyone that his trial, the proof stage is beginning April 5th. And Netanyahu does not want to serve time in prison, understandably. I'll just end with the final point. The Abraham Accords, Israel normalized ties with the great help of the Trump administration with 3 countries, and the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, and restored ties with Morocco. The Biden administration seems to be very supportive of it. It's a bipartisan goal in the United States to bring normalization between Israel and Arab countries. I don't think they're gonna actively encourage it, though. They just don't have the bandwidth. I'm hearing talks about, oh yes, we will promote normalization through a lens of dealing with climate change in the Middle East, partnerships on energy, but you're not going to have the sort of envoy, and you're definitely not going to have the sweeteners that the Trump administration offered, right? Some of the jokes here in Israel is a lot now. Relations are a little bit. It's a bit rocky with the UAE because of cancellation and trips. And one of the jokes is that it's impolite to come without F-35 in your hand, which was promised by the Trump administration. And understandably, from the Biden administration, they're saying, wait, does it serve our foreign policy objectives, even if the previous administration promised it? So there's going to be a limit to what this administration offers other countries to join the normalization ban, which I think Israel would very much want them to do more, but they understand the situation. So I'll end here, and I look forward to everyone else's chiming in and to our discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shira, for these enlightening remarks. Let me then continue and give the floor to Ambassador Jake Waltz, who will shed some light on the perspective of the Arab states and the Palestinians. Jake, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Andreas, and it's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished group here today. As Andreas said, I'm going to talk about the Arab views on the subject, which is a little bit tricky because there's no single Arab view on this or on any subject. But to get at it, I'm going to talk about some of the issues that Shira and Daniel already touched on a bit, and talk about it from the Arab perspective. And I'm going to talk about 3 issues: normalization with Israel, as Shira discussed, Israel-Palestine, and then a bit about Iran. Shira already described the normalization process as it's occurred over the past year, with 4 Arab countries establishing some form of diplomatic relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. These 4 countries expanded the scope of Arab state relations with Israel beyond the 2 countries, Egypt and Jordan, that previously signed peace treaties and established relations with Israel. Prior to last year, Arab thinking about the issue of normalization was shaped largely by the Arab Peace Initiative, which was a proposal put forward by the Saudi king about 20 years ago and subsequently endorsed by the Arab League. In essence, the Arab Peace Initiative envisioned a trade of full Arab normalization with Israel in return for full Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories and the establishment of a Palestinian state. The idea was that these steps would happen in tandem. What happened last year, starting with the UAE, with the Emirates, who agreed to establish relations with Israel up front, in effect changing the sequence of this trade-off. The Emiratis were saying, in effect, we will give Israel full normalization now in the hope that Israel will at some point in the future accommodate the Palestinians. And as Shira mentioned, the deal was sweetened for the Emiratis in two ways. One, the pledge from the Trump administration to sell the F-35s, but also a promise in some form from Israel to suspend efforts to annex parts of the West Bank. Likewise, with Sudan and Morocco, they got benefits from the United States, from the Trump administration as part of their deals. The key point here is that these Arab states put their national interests ahead of their sympathies for the Palestinians. Within the rest of the Arab world, the reaction to these deals was mixed. Allies of the Emirates, like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, were supportive, but the Palestinians were strongly opposed. The Palestinians viewed these deals as undercutting their position in potential peace negotiations with Israel by eliminating what they saw as their most important leverage. At first, the response from the Palestinian leadership and the public was quite harsh against the Emiratis and the others. But the Palestinians soon found themselves isolated in the Arab League. And the leadership quickly dialed back their official reaction. However, it's fair to say that most Palestinians felt betrayed by their Arab partners. So this brings us to the Biden administration. During the campaign and since the inauguration, the Biden team has expressed support for these normalization agreements. This is not a surprise, really, since this support for such normalization has been a feature of US foreign policy for many decades. What was different about Trump's approach is that he was willing to pay for these deals with US benefits. So for the Emirates, it was the F-35s. For Sudan, it was the removal from the terrorism list. And for Morocco, it was US recognition of its annexation of the Western Sahara. This, I think, is where the Biden administration's approach will diverge. They will support additional normalization deals, but they'll have to stand on their own merits. I don't think Biden will be willing to change US policy to pay for them the way Trump did. Now, looking ahead, I think the most important question is what Saudi Arabia does here. Israel would certainly love to expand the scope of normalization to include Saudi Arabia. Last year, Saudi Arabia held back from joining the others. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who we call MBS, seemed to be in favor of the normalization, but his father, the king, blocked it, apparently not wanting to undermine the Arab Peace Initiative that was put forward by one of his predecessors. Now, MBS finds himself at odds with the Biden administration over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and on other human rights issues. The question is, will MBS try to find a pathway back to favor in Washington via normalization with Israel? I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly a question worth keeping an eye on. For the Palestinians, they also want a pathway back to a better relationship with Washington after the Trump administration. And they, as part of this, may be willing to consider muting their response to additional normalization deals, possibly including Saudi Arabia, if they can get back on good terms with Washington. But Palestinian relations with the US are very complex right now. And I won't go into in a lot of detail, but we can talk about this more in the discussion. In any case, restoring the relationship between the United States and the Palestinians will not be easy. So let me switch tracks a bit and talk a little bit more about Israel-Palestine. And again, I'll just touch on it briefly. As both Dan and Shira have already said, this is not a subject that's a priority for the Biden administration. Secretary Blinken has expressed support for a two-state solution, and he's indicated that the administration wants to repair relations with the Palestinians that were damaged by Trump. But beyond that, the administration seems inclined to wait until after the election cycle in Israel, which could be a while. And also there will be elections in the Palestinian Authority. So I don't think the Biden administration is looking to be making any decisions here on this issue. Now for the Palestinians, this issue is their top priority, but they also understand they will have to address their internal political differences first through elections, as I said, which are scheduled in May in the West Bank and Gaza. The elections themselves, and especially the potential role of Hamas in a future PA government, will have major implications for relations between the Palestinians and both the United States and Israel. Related issues like continued settlement activity by Israel are also bound to prove contentious in the future. So while this issue is on the back burner for the US right now, it's inevitable that it will eventually come to the forefront and the parties will have to deal with it again. Finally, let me say a few words about Iran, where the picture is a little bit different. Here, the principal Arab players are Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and they stand firmly against Iran, and they want to confront what they see as an Iranian quest for regional dominance through interference in Arab countries, from Iraq to Lebanon to Yemen. On this, the Saudis and the Emiratis have common cause with Israel, which opposes not only Iran's regional activities, but most importantly, its nuclear program. Washington likewise opposes Iran and all of these activities, but the Biden administration's emphasis is on solving these problems diplomatically, while Israel and the Gulf states are more skeptical about the prospects of diplomacy. So is there a possibility that the Gulf states and Israel will join together even more closely to put pressure on Washington for an even tougher approach? This too bears watching. As I see it, the Gulf Arabs want Iran to be fully contained, but they want somebody else to do it for them. This view, I think, is reinforced by the Saudi and the Emirati experience in Yemen, where they intervened militarily against the Iranian-backed Houthis, but they met with little success. The Emiratis are now pulled out almost entirely from Yemen, and the Saudis are mostly in a defensive posture and seeking a ceasefire. Now, Iran itself poses a much more serious security challenge. Therefore, the Gulf states hope that the US and/or Israel will take the lead in confronting Iran. But this runs up against the Biden administration's desire to emphasize diplomacy over military options. Israel also wants the US to deal with Iran's nuclear program, either through ever harsher sanctions, or if that fails, through military means. Now, the Israelis, I think, are willing to act themselves against Iran, but I think they understand also that a military option only works with US support. And the Biden administration would rather not go that way. So this situation may lead once again to sharp disagreements between the US on one side and Israel and the Gulf Arabs on the other. Given the complexities of the situation, the Biden administration is proceeding cautiously, and they're making efforts to coordinate policy on Iran with Israel and the Gulf states before moving forward with the Iranians. I think the lack of close coordination was a failing of Obama's approach that Biden's team seems to understand and are trying to deal with. But navigating this difficult environment with Iran, Israel, and the Gulf states will be among the greatest foreign policy challenges for Biden, particularly in the Middle East. So briefly, where does that leave us? When Biden replaced Trump in the Oval Office, the direction of US policy on all of these issues changed. Arab views on Biden's new approach are mixed, reflecting their divergent views on the changes that Trump introduced to US policy. In some cases, like Iran, the Arabs are perhaps closer to the Israeli point of view than to the American. So it is this interaction among Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US in particular that is perhaps the most interesting aspect of this and deserves our attention in the period ahead. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion, and just want to say thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Yeah, thank you, Jake, for this very interesting analysis. Before we move to Professor Lee, let me just tell the audience again, you're most welcome to pose your question on the YouTube channel, and then these questions will be forwarded to me, and then I will post them to our panelists. Yeah, so for the final perspective, the European and German perspective on the matter, we will hear from Ulrich Lee. Mr. Lee, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andreas, for bringing me in, and thank you for, it's a great pleasure to contribute to this discussion. I don't want to bring a totally different perspective. It will be a German and European perspective, and you know that we do have general elections here in Germany as well, and we follow closely the events in Israel. I don't want to bring in a different analysis. I think the Biden administration will restore credible US engagement with Palestinians as well as Israelis, and the US will maintain its steadfast support for Israel. I also agree what has been said so far. The United States will work closely to promote Israel's standing and participation in United Nations bodies and other international organizations. I do want to comment on one point. The top priority, the Middle East is not the top priority. Yes, this is correct, but this can change overnight. And what we have seen so far is that Iran is the centerpiece of what we are discussing right now here. And that can change also the perspective from the European side overnight. I don't think that it's possible to go back to the view of Iran, what we have seen in the Obama administration. And I think that the general assessment and the ongoing process of the review will come to the conclusion, what has been said already, that Iran could develop into even a military problem. That brings me to the policy style of President Biden, and I would like to bring that in as a question. Yes, we know him. We know his commitment to Europe, his commitment to Israel, the friendship which has been stressed by Benjamin Netanyahu and others. He is predictable, but also we see something which came to a surprise when I look back to the new language towards Russia, what has been said most recently. This came to, at least for me as an observer of foreign and security policy, as a surprise. And the question is, what does that mean for his preparedness and his willingness to change his approach to critical questions of security? What does that mean when we speak about the relationship between diplomacy and the military means? I think perhaps we can discuss that at a later stage. That brings me to the question, what does that mean for Europe? I think it's out of the question that we Europeans have to bring more to the table. Yes, we do see an erosion of the United States leadership role in the world, but Europe is not in the waiting room. And if we follow the comments on European policy in these days, I think this is nothing reassuring for Europe. So when we take the current uncertainties into account, that the policy situation can change overnight, that even a military explosion in the Middle East is possible, then I think there is no time left for us Europeans. And my prediction or my assumption, or at least my wish for the German foreign and security policy and for the European policy, which is nearly the same approach, is that we will see a far more personal and diplomatic engagement of the European Union in the Middle East, but also, I mean, there's no necessity to repeat all the historical commitments of German foreign policy towards Israel. But I think at the current stage, we are not prepared. We are inward looking, and we are not prepared to fully take over that new role, which is absolutely necessary for us Europeans. So in a nutshell, we are not in the driving seat, but as friendly observers, we can find ourselves in a position which demands much more commitment overnight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ulrich, for this European and German perspective. Let me maybe pick up some points that were, or one point in particular that was raised almost by everybody, that there's a discussion at least that to some extent the Middle East is a little bit less on the focus of American foreign policy, and particularly the Biden administration. There was an article by Martin Indyk from the Council of Foreign Relations last year in the Wall Street Journal that said the Middle East isn't worth it anymore. Yeah, putting it provocatively, of course. But of course, the question is indeed, is there a difference in the approach, in the view of the centrality of the Middle East in U.S. policy and world politics as compared to 5, 10, 20 years ago? In the Economist, there was recently a headline talking about the Middle East and the U.S. policy, the Great Retreat, number 41. Basically saying they were trying to get out of it for many times, but still it has been challenging, and that picks up a little bit of what Ulrich said, that it could change overnight. So maybe could we maybe start with Daniel and Jake, give us a little bit of perspective on that topic, again, delve a little bit deeper on the question of a diminished interest of the US, and maybe in the long run in the Middle East. Is that really true? Could that change overnight? What is your perspective? Maybe let's start with Daniel, because you raised that point first.
I do think it is a diminished interest. It is absolutely true that events can change everything quickly. If there were to be sustained Iranian attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure of the kind that we saw earlier, but continuing, that would change things pretty dramatically. Similarly, if Iran were to fire a long-range missile at any one of its foes, that would change things dramatically. I do think that there has been a fundamental shift in global politics, in that the United States faces a major challenge to the global order and to its own position by China. And that's not going to go away. And that is going to focus the attention of policymakers above all. So I have a hard time imagining that is going to change dramatically in the next 4 years. So I think the baseline is, yes, the pivot to the East is now a reality because of just absolutely riveting changes in the power structure of global affairs. But yes, we could be drawn back into the Middle East in a more decisive sort of way. I remember President Biden in the last in the Obama administration was the foremost spokesman for cutting our losses in Afghanistan and Iraq and getting out sooner rather than later. He's been in this game for a long, long time, and he's seen just what poor dividends the United States has accrued from its many decades of engagement in the Middle East. And on top of all of that, as everyone knows, the global energy picture is dramatically different from what it used to be. The US is the #1 producer of hydrocarbons in the world right now. We still have an important interest in the free flow of energy from the Middle East, but we have nothing like the same concerns that we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. Israel has always been an important interest for American policymakers. Israel's security seems as assured now as it ever has. So I think that the fundamental structural elements confirm that there will be a much greater focus on Asia. But again, as Harold Macmillan said to John F. Kennedy, events, my dear boy, events. That's what really drives, the priorities of the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Jake, do you want to comment on that as well?
Sure. Well, first, I agree with what Dan Benjamin just said. I mean, I think the pivot to Asia has been underway for a while now. Numerous presidents over the past decades have tried to de-emphasize the Middle East. I think there may be only one thing that Obama and Trump and Joe Biden agree on, which is that they've all tried to de-emphasize attention to the Middle East, and none of them have succeeded. And I'm not sure that Biden will succeed in this either. The Middle East, as Dan said, has a way of drawing you back in, even if you try to pay attention to other things. Dan talked about Iran or attacks on Saudi oil fields that could draw us back in, which is all very true. And I would just add to that the Palestinian issue, which seems to be on the back burner now for everybody, is the kind of issues that tends to come at you without a lot of advance warning. And we've seen that before in the past as well. Just when things were very quiet was when the first Intifada broke out, seemingly sparked by a minor traffic accident, and it turned into a major conflagration that lasted for years. I'm not predicting that will happen again, but I'm just saying that there are a whole range of issues in the Middle East that are very much a tinderbox that could explode with little warning and with little indication that it's about to happen. And those are the kind of things that will inevitably force Biden to pay attention to the Middle East, even if his attention right now is very much on domestic issues in the U.S. and when it comes to foreign policy, in terms of dealing with a challenge coming from Asia and to restoring our relations with Europe that were damaged under Trump. So yes, I think there is a pivot underway, but whether that continues remains to be seen.
Andreas, can I comment on that also?
Yes, please. Please. I was just about to call on you, Shira, because I know that you're also an expert on Israel-China relations and have worked on that. So would you maybe want to comment on this aspect, particularly also from the perspective of what maybe a diminished interest, or to some extent maybe diminished interest of the U.S. in the Middle East could mean for the triangle Israel, China, U.S.
Sure. I'll just start with that I agree with both Jake and Daniel that, the pivot has been underway for a long time, but, they've been trying to pivot, but, the Middle East tend to sort of insert itself, right? So Jake spoke about an intifada, a Palestinian uprising, but there was also an Arab Spring, and you don't know those things when they're going to happen. And the conditions in Arab countries have not fundamentally changed in the last decade. So I think this is also something we should talk about. Now, there have been talks now in the Biden administration, reevaluation, changing their Middle East strategy. And I think, yes, they will withdraw from Afghanistan. This is a stretch to call Afghanistan the Middle East, right? But what does it really mean? Are they changing posture completely? Is the United States leaving Iraq? Is it leaving its largest Air Force base in the Middle East in Qatar? Is it leaving other bases? I don't think so. It's not even leaving Syria completely, right? So in a sense, I think we're not seeing the big change of, the US is out. It's not out, it's still very much in, and especially when you compare it to the other sort of powers. And I really appreciate what Professor Lee was talking about Europe, because when we talk about the great powers, right, we talk about China, and China has a very different strategy in the Middle East, and I'll talk about it in a moment, and Russia, and you can argue Russia is very influential in the Middle East, but when you look at data and you compare, there's no comparison between US presence in the Middle East and Russia's presence today. And then the EU. So I think the US is still, here in the region where I'm speaking to you from. There's no question there's a understanding that it wants to get out. Oh, it wants to withdraw, and like in Martin Indyk in his very typical and amusing but very smart ways, saying it like it's not worth it. It's not worth it, but there's still interest and there's still commitments, and it's very difficult to change US policy in a very meaningful way. But I think it's important to think in the long run from the US perspective, and I'm putting the Israeli political issues aside, because every time you talk about US aid to Israel, it always goes into the political place. And I don't want to take it to a political direction, but if you think of US policy in the Middle East, right, the US is selling very sophisticated weapons to countries that can afford it. And it's giving other countries that can afford it, like the big three, you talk about Egypt and Israel and Jordan, a lot of other foreign military funding, right? There's a lot of military aid that goes, but not so much of the US is going to the people of the Middle East. So the United States gives Egypt in every single year military aid that is equivalent to economic development support for the whole region combined. And in a sense, when I'm thinking about the US going forward, and I'm putting Israel aside for a second, because I don't think Israel needs the financial component from the US, right? It needs the access to sophisticated technology, it needs the affiliation and the protection in the international organizations and so many other things that the United States support for Israel means, but it's not the money. But I think this could be a more useful way forward for the US as it like plans its withdrawal, investing people and not just how should I say it, autocratic regimes in the name of stability, which doesn't get you much stability. So this is one thing. About China. Really interesting to talk about it. Also from the US perspective. So I don't know how many people have been following this, but Israel has been developing its ties with China mostly since 2013. Israel also pivoted to Asia for a variety of reasons. We don't have to get into it. Advanced relations, developed innovation partnership, strategic partnership that has the name innovation in it, which is very sensitive. And at the time, it didn't draw so much ear in Washington, although there's background with Israel selling China defense technology that the US didn't want China to have, and also argued that it was originated in the US. Then under the Trump administration, I think many of us have not realized how quickly the strategic competition between the US and China will turn into rivalry. And that took all the countries by surprise, right? The Europeans also, with a lot of demands coming from the Trump administration not to have any business with China. And also Israel was sort of forced into it. And you may remember people who are big supporters of Israel, John Bolton and Pompeo, basically threatening Israel, saying you won't have intelligence sharing with us if you continue allowing Chinese investment in your country. Interestingly, Biden administration is talking about restoring alliances, and China is a key point in discussions with Germany, which is really interesting, right? And also East Asian countries. You don't hear about anything with Israel in that regard. China and Israel have not been mentioned the same sentence since this administration has come to power. Israel is very happy about it for now, because Israel has interests vis-a-vis China like Germany does, but Israel is in different position than European countries, right? Israel relies on the US so much that it can't tell the US, well, you know what, sorry, you have supply chain issues, but we have our interests. Israel is in a different position, but I anticipate this will come more. And it's interesting that Israel was just moved to CENTCOM, Central Command of the United States, from a military perspective, but if you look at the world from a great power competition perspective, Israel should be really with Europe on that, because what the US cares about is technological partnership, and Israel is a technological power like European countries. So in a sense, I feel like we'll see more on that. Just last point, I think Europe is such an important player, and it's often downplayed in this region. In the context of Israel, it's very important. I don't think people realize how important it is in the Palestinian arena. The Palestinians are going to elections now, not because of pressure from the US, it's going as a result of pressure from Europe that told the Palestinians that they need to have elections. Also, the European countries are bankrolling the Palestinian Authority. The United States have not given them money in the last few years, so it's all European support. And also Europe is closer, so what happens here is likely to affect European interests faster than it affects US interests.
Yeah, thank you, Shira. And this brings me directly to Ulrich. In this discussion and this question of to what extent the Middle East is of less interest to the United States. If that's really true, that does not necessarily mean that's the same for Europe. So with regard to Europe, as Shira said, Europe is closer to the Middle East. There is, of course, the refugee situation that's of utmost interest to Germany and the rest of Europe as well. So, Ulrich, you said Germany or Europe generally has to bring more to the table with regards to the Middle East. What would that be? What could that be? And what, particularly under the perspective that the U.S. Interest, at least, could be diminished in the region.
Thank you, Andreas. As we do have a no smoke screen debate, I'm not going to defend or dilute the current moment of weakness, what we live through in Europe, which is quite obvious when you look at the variety of problems which we are currently facing. But I want to bring in, and perhaps that could be part of the answer, but also a question to our American friends, two European powers, which are a kind of strategic concern for the European Union as well. One is Turkey, and the second is Russia. And my question is, how do you see, and the question goes perhaps to our American friends, but also to others, how do you see the role of Turkey in the region? I mean, Turkey behaves as a member of the North Atlantic Alliance, as a regional power, which is more and more distancing itself from core European values, and which has quite obvious an own strategic vision and a strategic goal. And the second is Russia. And that brings me to my remark in the very beginning of the new Cold War between America and Russia. How do you perceive Russia in the area? And perhaps in order to answer at least a part of what has been asked, if the European Union comes to terms to answer strategic questions and to define its strategic map, I would put Russia and Turkey as the first two items or centerpiece of what has to be answered in the near future, in the foreseeable future, by the European Union. And when we do have a more strategic vision and solve our unfinished problems in the periphery of Europe, then I think we could be a more reasonable and also a more reliable and substantial partner in the Middle East. I'm not going to elaborate on the military capacities and capabilities of the European Union. I think that my approach is NATO first. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ulrich. Maybe quickly, Jake and Daniel, do you want to respond to the role of Turkey and Russia? Maybe let's start with Jake this time.
Okay, I'll try to take on Turkey. Maybe leave Dan to talk about Russia, which you know better. Turkey is a complex subject. The Turks are engaged in so many different areas, and they're sort of fighting a number of different conflicts on many different fronts at once. They're involved militarily in Syria, in Iraq. They're involved militarily in Libya. They are at odds with the Greeks and the Cypriots about maritime boundaries, and by extension, they're at odds with the European Union as a result of that. They have historically difficult relations with Israel going back about 10 years, and they've recently been at odds with the Egyptians as well on Eastern Mediterranean gas issues. So that's a lot to have on your plate for sort of a middle rank power like Turkey. And I think my sense is that they're finding themselves, the Turks are finding themselves overextended, and very recently have begun to try to repair some of these relationships. With Egypt, there's a bit of a rapprochement that's just begun in the past few weeks. even with Israel, they seem to be open to finding some way to restore a better relationship. I can't speak really too much about the EU and Turkey, but that's obviously complex. There are many facets to that as well. I know that the Turks played a significant role in trying to stem the migrant flow from Syria to the European Union a number of years ago. Whether they're prepared to continue doing that, I think depends a lot on the financial issues that they have with the European Union. So I'm not sure that it answers the question exactly, but I think Turkey plays a pivotal role in so many of these different aspects of the regional issues. And they find themselves at odds with so many different players all at the same time. It's hard to see how they can sustain that in the long term, and I think they will have to retrench a bit going forward.
Yeah, Daniel, please, if you have some thoughts on Turkey and Russia.
So I do have some thoughts on that. First, I just wanted to respond to Shira's remark about U.S. engagement with the massive Arab countries in the region, which continue to have sclerotic economies, enormous corruption, unrepresentative institutions, and the like. And I would just say that the early remarks from the administration, I think, are in line with your wishes, in the sense that I believe Secretary Blinken told his Egyptian interlocutor that human rights was going to be a major concern. Personally, I worry tremendously about upheaval in Egypt, where the repression has reached historic proportions. And I think that the president, the national security advisor, and Secretary Blinken have all emphasized corruption. And of course, we know that democracy has been a chord that they have continued to strike since, during the campaign. So I think all of those things will come into play. And in some ways, de-emphasizing the security dimension in the region makes it more possible to emphasize those aspects. If you're not going to have to pay the Egyptians off for their relationship with Israel, for maintaining the peaceful terms with Israel, then you can put more pressure on them on the other issues. The irony right now is that Israel has a better relationship with Egypt than the US does by a million miles. So lots of curiosities have evolved over time. To pick up on what Jake was saying, I think one of the really interesting challenges that will face the administration is how it gets involved in what has been termed the Arab Civil War, which is really, this long-running conflict between the Gulf Arabs, to some extent Egypt, and a number of others on the one side, and a Gulf Arab, but not on that side, Qatar and Turkey on the other side, essentially secularists versus Islamists, or conservative Sunnis versus Sunnis who lean towards the Muslim Brotherhood and a more change-oriented, for lack of a better phrase, agenda. And because of Turkey's overextension, which Jake described well, because of the Saudis' inability to realize their goals vis-a-vis Qatar, vis-a-vis Yemen, maybe there's a chance now for rapprochement. It's an interesting question whether the US has a positive role to play there. It is certainly this conflict that has caused most of the problems in the region, whether it's in the Horn of Africa or Libya, over recent years, much less so than, I would argue, than Iran, although Iran remains a very, very difficult presence in the region. Regarding Russia, to answer Ulrich's question, things are going to get better before they are going to get worse before they get better. I think that much is clear. We are awaiting some very harsh sanctions that will essentially be meant to answer the mail on Navalny, on the SolarWinds hack, on, for some Democrats, it will be for the election interference in 2 successive elections For Republicans, it's answering pent-up demand from having to hold their tongues for the 4 years of Donald Trump's really unseemly relationship with Vladimir Putin. I think the administration does have a sense that when you're dealing with Russia, which remains a nuclear superpower, there has to be a floor under the relationship, and that you can't let things get way too out of hand. But there's some bad winds that are going to blow first. As for Russia's role in the region, I think that's a really interesting and, to my mind, kind of imponderable question right now. The people around Joe Biden, I think, are going to put a lot of blame on Russia for the disaster that was Syria, because it was Russian defense of Assad that really opened the door to a complete humanitarian tragedy. I think one of the interesting questions that will face Europe in this context is, what do you do about all the American sanctions that are preventing rebuilding Syria and stemming the tide of refugees? There are just a lot of different knotty issues in this region that will affect Europe in a big way, and which I don't think anyone has an easy answer to. But certainly just to come back where I was a moment ago, the near term in relations with Russia going to be very, very challenging.
Yeah, thank you. Shira, as I know you have to leave us relatively soon, let me just first give you the opportunity, if you wanted to comment on what Daniel said about U.S., Israel, Egypt relations, if you want to. But in addition to that, I want to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian question is not the most pressing right now, but still I want to ask you, particularly with the Abraham Accords and the Palestinian opposition against it. It seems, at least, that is what you can read from different sources. There seems to be kind of also a rapprochement between the Palestinian authorities and Hamas to some extent. So the question is, what is the effect of the Abraham Accords in that relationship? Could you comment a little bit more in that regard? And also, maybe adding to that, there was recently an article in Haaretz, I think, saying that the pragmatic relationship of talking about the pragmatic relationship of Hamas and Netanyahu to some extent, saying that for both sides, the other side is the devil they know to some extent. So how does that play into this relationship, particularly given that we have this difference in the Palestinians between the authority and Hamas?
Yes, so really interesting question, and there's a lot there to unpack. The policies of the Trump administration toward the Palestinians, whether you support these policies or not, and then coming with the normalization agreements have made the Palestinian Authority, for the first time in years, go for elections and what they call, it's not reconciliation with Hamas, but partnership, understanding that the divide does not serve their interests. There's also, the Gaza, Hamas, it's always like the interplay between, the UAE and Turkey and all these other tensions that, Daniel spoke about, and there are always bigger players. First of all, just on the normalization, I think it is important to say that the Palestinians did view it as a stab in the back. They were not ready for it. Relations were sour with the United Arab Emirates before, because one of the reasons they're also the patrons of Mohammed Ahlan, who is a contender from Fatah, from Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president's party. There's personal animosity there. The Palestinian response to normalization with Bahrain, with Sudan, and with Morocco was much more toned down. So that's, I think, also important to mention. It's not all the same. But then you go through this issue of elections forming, which would form some sort of a unity government if the elections take place. And we have to put it in you know, we've been through this for a long time. Last time there were Palestinian elections was 15 years ago. But this seems to be more serious than everyone had thought that they would go so far. If the elections take place, it's first parliamentary elections and then Palestinian elections, the presidential elections, then you would have Hamas potentially in the government. And Hamas, as we said before, it's affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which all these countries that Israel is friends with are trying to limit their influence. So there are pressures, right? Do we want this? Do we don't want this? Is also pressure on Mahmoud Abbas. I don't think the Palestinians themselves have solved their differences. The animosity between Fatah and Hamas, between West Bank and Gaza, is really animosity. There are different reasons. Mahmoud Abbas is 86 years old. He's trying to like win legitimacy again. As I said before, I know that behind the scenes there was a lot of European pressure going to these elections. And because the Europeans are funding them, they can't say no, right? It's coming, but it also came in a time where it seemed like it would serve their interests better. As it looks now, and I'm all for, I think Palestinian elections is overdue. I think if you believe that a two-state solution is the best outcome for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you need Gaza and the West Bank to be under the same leadership. And it would be better if it's a leadership that maybe is imperfect, but at least it's not a leadership that uses violence. So that's the Palestinian Authority. On the other hand, the factors have changed in a way that if the elections take place now, I think Hamas will be strengthened. It doesn't mean that they will take all the votes, but you're bringing them in without them making any compromises. There was a letter to the US, and then it turned out it's not really a letter. Hamas is a terrorist organization. The people rule, I see them as victims of Hamas. It's like one elections, one time, right? And Hamas didn't really win the elections, so that's also going backward to the facts. But it's not a governing organization, so it's a big issue, and Hamas needs to abide by 3 rules to be sort of accepted by the international community. It's the renunciation of violence, recognizing Israel's right to exist, and accepting previous peace agreements. I'll tell you that I think from my perspective, the most important one is the no violence, right? He doesn't have to join the Zionist movement at the moment, but you need no violence, and Hamas has not been willing to make this compromise at the moment. So how this plays out, what Israel and the US do, if the PA understands that it can't just like assume the Europeans would be okay with the outcome of the elections and Israel would be okay with the US because Mahmoud Abbas is a legitimate leader, that remains to be said. But, and that goes to your other questions, Andrea, the Palestinian Authority says, but Israel speaks to Hamas all the time. You have better relationship with Hamas. Israel has de facto been strengthening Hamas. I don't know if people here know, in 2018, we thought there was going to be another round of violence between Israel and Hamas. It looked all the way there. The UN helped mediate a ceasefire. Egypt came along, and then Qatar came along. Qatar had their own issues with Washington, and they basically said, we will give money. We will give money to poor families in Gaza to calm there was really a humanitarian crisis. There was electricity for 3 hours a day, so terrible. No water, really terrible crisis. We will pay for poor family, but you know what? Qatar also gives money, they call it capacity building. It goes straight to the Hamas government. And I'll tell you, now the money comes in different ways, but it used to come to Ben Gurion Airport. And that those suitcases with cash, they would not drive themselves to Gaza. So it's Israeli security service that would take it. The money would come in dollars. Israel would convert it to shekels because shekels is what the Israeli currency is what you use in Gaza. So in a sense, Israel praying protection to Hamas, right? So that to prevent being fired by rockets, it has a very pragmatic relationship with Hamas, mediated by Qatar, by the Egyptians, by the UN. But it's something that it's complicated to demand the international community not to speak to Hamas and not to accept Hamas when you're saying de facto Israel accepts Hamas and not only accepts it, kind of facilitates it. So it's again lots of ironies here. I can stay for another few minutes, so I'm just really interested in the discussion. So thank you, but you don't have to turn to me again if you don't have more questions.
Thank you very much, Shira. And maybe we might, because Jake wants to comment on what you have just said. Jake, you have the floor.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow on to a couple of things that Shira just talked about. First is about normalization and the Palestinians. There's been some commentary along the lines that the Palestinians should look upon normalization as an opportunity to leverage Israel rather than the other way around. And this idea sort of flows from what the Emirates did by, when they normalized with Israel, they got Netanyahu to promise that he would not annex parts of the West Bank as he was about to do. And that's something that if it had happened, it would have been very detrimental to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, of course, didn't look at it that way. The thinking is that, say, a country like Saudi Arabia could offer to normalize with Israel, but insist that Israel would take some step to limit settlement growth, for example, or limit certain kinds of settlement activity as a way of dealing with that issue. The problem with that is, the Palestinians historically have never been good at taking advantage of opportunities, and I'm not sure that they would be able to do it in this case. And also the Saudis are not as skilled diplomatically as the Emiratis are. And the Saudis, in fact, may not be wanting to do the Palestinians a favor. Their main interest in normalization might be to get back on good terms with Washington, not to do the Palestinians a favor. But that's one area to keep an eye on. Secondly, the whole discussion about Hamas and the PA is very important, and there hasn't been a lot of attention to it yet, I don't think, partly because it's up until now, it's not been 100% certain that the Palestinians would actually have these elections. And it's still not 100% certain. They'll only go ahead if Israel allows voting to take place in East Jerusalem in some form, as they did in the past. And that issue has not been resolved up until this point. If the elections do go ahead, the outcome will have an important role in determining whether Hamas has a role in the Palestinian Authority government, and if so, how the international community, the United States in particular, and also Israel will deal with that authority. When this issue arose in 2006, when Hamas won the election and formed a government, the United States and Israel cut off all dealings with the Palestinian Authority. For the United States, it was very much driven by legal issues and American laws that prohibit support to any group that's involved in terrorism. In this case, Hamas is considered a terrorist organization. As soon as they entered the PA, and under American law, the PA itself was viewed as a terrorist organization, and we cut off all the dealings with that. Israel took a similar line. How the Biden administration will deal with this is unclear, but they will be constrained quite a bit by the existing American law that limits dealings and assistance to Palestinians involved in terrorism. So that's a tricky game that President Abbas is dealing with in calling elections. Clearly, he wants to hold an election where he regains legitimacy for himself and for the PA. But in doing so, he risks giving Hamas a position in the government, which not only would undermine Abbas's position, but it might undermine ties between the United States and the Palestinians and any prospect of Israel and the Palestinians working together in a constructive way. So that's a big issue that I think we need to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me maybe, as the last topic, move to Iran a little bit again. I mean, it has been raised in the statements, but maybe let's delve a little bit deeper in that matter. There is currently before the International Court of Justice proceedings ongoing, not specifically with regard to the JCPOA, but with regard to the sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration, or reimposed rather by the Trump administration. My question is, and that goes to all panelists. If we will see some development there, the International Court of Justice, for example, issuing a ruling in that regard in the time coming, while there is still the Biden administration has not yet rejoined the JCPOA, while this is still going on, how would that effect, if any, have an effect, if any, on these developments? That's the first part of the question. And then again, maybe with regards to the JCPOA itself, is there will there be? Are you foreseeing some development soon there? Are you or are you thinking that at least until the elections in Iran in June, whoever will be president then, we will not see much development there? Maybe maybe Shira, if you want to comment on that from the perspective of Israel, if you have a view on that, because I know you have to go. Otherwise, I will move it to Dan and Jake.
Please move it to the others. I was able to postpone my joining my other session, so we're fine. I can comment on others that I spoke about.
Great. And maybe Dan, if you could start on that regard.
I confess I do not know the answers on these subjects. As someone who's watching very closely a German-American issue having to do with extraterritorial sanctions, namely Nord Stream 2, I think it would be very interesting if you had a judgment handed down on these other sanctions. I can imagine that some in the Biden administration would feel relieved if they at least had something pushing them to get them out of this practice. But extraterritorial sanctions are really quite popular with Congress, and they are they've become part of the armament of American diplomacy. And so my guess is that you would not see a very rapid adherence to such a judgment. I do think that the administration would try to deal with it in a way that it would be wrapped up into any negotiation with the Iranians, and therefore it would become kind of a secondary issue. But this is the choreography of diplomacy that can get quite baffling. Jake may have a better idea on that. And as for the elections, that's a real wild card, because there's, I think, a growing expectation that some of the people who made the JCPOA possible will no longer be on the scene. But I think that in the midst of the campaign and all the rest in Iran, it's very difficult to re-engage, and difficult to re-engage given all the consultations that need to go on right now with Israel, with the Gulf Arabs and the like, to ensure that we have the kind of understandings we need to go forward. It was a different situation in 2015. Breaking through diplomatically with Iran required building some trust, and building some trust required doing things in secret. But I think it is a different situation today. All I can say is I hope Jake has a better answer.
I hope I don't disappoint you. Well, on the question of sanctions, I don't really have anything more to add to what Dan said. On the second question, which sort of gets to the negotiations between between Iran and the US, we're currently sort of in an impasse where the Iranians have said they won't do anything till the administration rolls back the sanctions that Trump imposed against them after he pulled out of the JCPOA. Whereas the administration has said they're not going to do anything until the Iranians first come into compliance with the JCPOA. So it's basically what in the US we would call a Mexican standoff. We're getting much closer to the Iranian election, and I think we're at the point now where the Iranians are not in the position to make any sort of compromise from their position. So I suspect that we're basically frozen until we know the outcome of the Iranian election. That probably suits the administration fine because they need to do a little more homework with the Israelis and with the Gulf states to make sure that the policy that they do eventually end up with on Iran, it doesn't run into opposition there. So I think we're in a slower phase in terms of getting back to negotiations with the Iranians. Eventually, there's going to have to be a sort of a two-step dance where the Iranians and the Americans both agree to take some step simultaneously. Neither one is going to go first on their own. But that's going to be a little tricky. That kind of negotiation is going to take a while. And I think now we're at the point where the Iranian election is going to have to happen first.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Ulrich, do you have a view on what role Germany and the EU could play, if any, in that possible rapprochement between Iran and the US with regards to the JCPOA?
So perhaps it's a lack of imagination, which I do have. When I compare the situation in these days with 2015, then the question is, do we have more trust in Iran than in 2015? And as far as the JCPOA is concerned, I don't have that imagination. History doesn't repeat itself. And if you follow the debate on Iran in Europe, and if you compare it to what is currently discussed and debated in the United States, then you see a gap, and that gap has something to do with our worldview. So I'm rather pessimistic. Personally, that's my number one security concern I do have, and it could be for us Europeans. It could be a confrontation with reality. So forgive me that personal perspective and that rather grim outlook, but that's the situation as I do see. And what I do expect from the Biden administration, that we will perhaps see on Iran a more a change of tone and language in the foreseeable future as well.
Okay, thank you. And maybe as a kind of a last word, Shira, we kind of started off with you giving us some insights about the development in the with regards to the Israeli elections and the outcome. Obviously, I haven't followed the developments in the last 1.5 hours, but maybe, although of course it's very difficult, what's your guess? Will it be to some extent again a Netanyahu government, or might Yair Lapid to some extent pull off a government on a more secular rule, or maybe because he has to include so many different coalition partners that it would not change anything? Maybe your view on that, would it make no difference, maybe, whoever forms a government, because they have to include so many different parties? Could you give us a kind of a last kind of 2 cents on that?
Sure. So, I'm not in the business of predictions, and I think I know why, right? But because you're asking for my personal view and you're not going to hold me accountable to this. I'm just going to say with the caveat that first of all, we don't have all the full information yet. The second thing is that I think we as people, I'm not a psychologist, but there's a known phenomena of our biases, right? And it's very hard for us as people to imagine a different reality. And having been voting in Israeli elections for many, many years and having Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu remaining the Prime Minister, no matter if Likud, his party, wins the most votes or not, it's just hard for me to imagine a different outcome given those results that we see today. And the results are that still the Likud and what we spoke about before, the sort of like the pro-Bibi, pro-Netanyahu bloc, right? Because it's a coalition government. It's very different from the US. It's not a two-party system. It's more similar to, it's a parliamentary regime. It's easier for them to form a coalition. It's easier for them to form a coalition also because they're ideologically more aligned. It's a form of right-wing parties, and some are more to the right, some are left to the right, more right to the right, but they're still all right. It's not an amalgamation of parties that think very differently about fundamental issues that like you have on the other side. Also, Netanyahu is just, we can talk about these ability to govern and other things, but I mean, there's no competitor for him on the political stance. He's just a great politician, and he's able to, he's proved it again and again. He builds coalitions, he makes those alliances, and what he needs is basically now defectors to come from the other bloc and supplement his coalition to what you need. You need a 61 majority, and then he does it. And a lot of people say we will not sit with Netanyahu, we're not sitting with Netanyahu, but they've been saying it in the previous elections also, and they have gone in and sat with him. So this is a likely scenario that he will be able to pull it off again and form a coalition. And this time the coalition could be much more stable than the previous coalition because they will agree on the basic lines. Some of these parties would be happy with what Netanyahu gives them in terms of, and it's very powerful. You think of parties that have 7 seats, but you get the portfolio of defense minister. It's crazy, but this is the type of negotiations that are going to happen. And they will give Netanyahu what he wants, which is probably just a ticket out of the trial. A sentence. It's very difficult with the timelines, and we can talk about this if we have a moment, but this could happen. The other scenario, which is also not necessarily not in Netanyahu's favor, is just the 5th elections, and this is probably as likely as any other scenario, even more. They can form a coalition, and so there's an interim government. Netanyahu is still about to remain the prime minister, and he's going to a 5th election. And so this is possible. Having a real alternative, I mean, it is, again, it's possible. Could be that you have someone like Yair Lapid forms but then it's harder, right? Because you have Gideon Sa'ar, a Likud refugee, and Naftali Bennett. They're more to the right. They're more hawkish than Netanyahu. They will sit in the government, and Avigdor Lieberman, they will sit in the government with Meretz, a party that calls for the only party that has it on its platform end to the occupation. Naftali Bennett doesn't think there's occupation. So they can form a government and agree on sort of domestic issues and passing a budget and stuff. But when it starts getting to the other fundamental issues, they're going to disagree. And so it's not going to be a very stable government. It could last for about 2 years. But I think, we're talking here, and as someone living here, it's crazy. You're going to 5th elections, and with the pandemic, the whole world is under crisis, right? So unemployment is high everywhere, and the debt to GDP ratio and all these indicators are crazy, and people could kind of forget. But in Israel, it started before that because there hasn't been a stable government since basically the end of 2018. There hasn't been a budget, and a government working without a budget is not an effective government. You can't allocate, how is Israel going to repay the debt? How is it going to put people back into work? How is it going to pave roads? How is it going to, fix the education system where my children, it gets to you on the personal level, right? My children go to school here. Israel needs a tax reform. How are you going to do these things? So in a sense, the public is fed up. They want a government, no matter what government. They just want a government because they want people to take care of their basic needs. But because everything is so political and because the tensions around the trials have been dominating the discussions, it's hard to see how we come out of this deadlock. So I'm also not like Ulrich. I don't have very uplifting news, but maybe it's Passover is coming, and maybe for the holiday we'll have a good surprise to have a functioning government here.
Okay, thank you, Shira. Well. Now we have covered a lot of ground, talked a lot of different issues, unpacked a lot of very complex questions. I'm kind of reminded of my teacher in international law when I studied at NYU, who said, "Understanding means lifting you from a lower level of confusion to a higher level of confusion." And I'm pretty sure we've succeeded in that today. Of course, we couldn't answer all the questions, but I hope it was very interesting and very instructive for all of you who joined in from all around the world. So thank you very much. Thank you, of course, also to the panelists. Yeah, and thank you very much for your very engaging, very interesting discussion and remarks. And of course, then finally, thank you to the American Academy and the Deutsche Israelische Gesellschaft for hosting this event. It was a privilege to chair this panel. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks to you all. Thank you.